And thanks to everyone for being here today. I know lives are very, very busy at the moment. So we're grateful that you decided to spend an hour with us talking about what we believe to be a really, really critical issue. As Rachel shared, my name is Casey Carter Swegman. I'm the Director of Public Policy at the Tahirih Justice Center. I've been with Tahirih almost 13 years now, most of that spent in a direct services capacity providing case management and safety planning to survivors and individuals at risk of forced and child marriage. And over the past couple of years, have stepped into the policy role, focusing on immigration policy as well as policy related to forced and child marriage. And if we go to the next slide, I'll just give a very brief overview of the Tahirih Justice Center for those who might be less familiar with us. We are a national nonprofit organization founded in 1997 to provide free legal and social services to immigrant survivors of gender-based violence, fleeing persecution, and seeking safety in the United States. And if we go to the next slide, you'll see that in 2011 is when we launched the Forced Marriage Initiative, which is a special project of the Tahirih Justice Center that focuses specifically on individuals that are in the United States that are facing the threat of forced marriage, whether they're children or adults, but do not need an immigration attorney. They're US citizens, they're legal permanent residents, they have refugee or asylum status, or they're here on a student visa. So they didn't need sort of the historic immigration legal services that we would provide, but all the other expertise that we had in terms of working with survivors of forced and child marriage needed to be available to them. So we launched the Forced Marriage Initiative after we did a study on sort of the prevalence of forced marriage in the United States. And we surveyed attorneys, advocates, law enforcement, others in the space that work with survivors, and found that there were as many as 3,000 cases of forced marriage in the United States over a 2-year period. So it's a very real issue. Again, our work does focus on both forced marriage impacting children and forced marriage as it impacts those 18 and above. The youngest survivor I ever served was 11, and the oldest survivor that our program has served was almost 60. So it really runs the gamut. Today, we are going to be focusing on our efforts to prevent the forced marriage of our most vulnerable. Those are children under the age of 18. And you'll learn more from Alex why that is such a critical piece of the puzzle when we talk about eliminating forced marriage in the United States, focusing on eliminating child marriage as a core component of that end goal. So if we go to the next slide, I'll just do a very brief overview of our perspective on forced marriage as it's occurring in the United States. So our definition, and it is sort of a widely used definition, it's very similar to what's used at the United Nations and around the world, that forced marriage is where one or both people do not or cannot consent to the marriage and typically involves elements of force, fraud, or coercion. A forced marriage is not arranged marriage, in which families might take the lead, but the ultimate decision about whether, when, and whom to marry remains with the individuals. And on the next slide, we'll dive into what that means a little bit more, because it can feel complex both to service providers, to advocates, to experts, researchers, and journalists, as well as to the person going through this experience. So, as part of our early conversations with people who reach out to us for help, we walk through sort of the building blocks of consent. What does consent mean? And it's multifaceted. So, it is not just yes to marriage, but it's I can freely express my wishes, my opinions, my preferences throughout the process without negative consequences and without feeling fear. For example, if a matchmaker presents me and my parents with an option and I don't like that option, I can say no without being afraid that there's going to be punishment. And I can say no as many times as I need to until an appropriate match is found. Again, without feeling like I only have so many chances to get it right before they start to shame me or ostracize me, etc. You also have to think about whether or not you consent to the idea to get married at all. That is a choice that a person does get to make. And so it really is rooted there. Do I want to get married at all? And if the answer is yes, and if the answer is you do want the support and help of your family and community in that process, then the other pieces of consent are the person, which we already talked about, and the timing. This comes up a lot in our cases where folks will call us and they'll say, you know what, I was okay with the process. I was okay with following the tradition of my family and having them be involved, but they promised me I could finish high school and go to college before we would talk about getting married. And now all of a sudden I'm only in 11th grade and they're making plans and they won't stop no matter what I say. So it's the idea of getting married at all, the person, the timing, and having the ability to express wishes and preferences and have opinions without consequences or fear. And a really big piece of thinking about what a lack of consent can look like, who's vulnerable to force, fraud, or coercion. Um, Everyone is, but minors are especially vulnerable for a myriad of reasons. Oftentimes, they are under the legal age to marry altogether, and that is by default someone who cannot consent to marry. Being young also comes with a whole host of other vulnerabilities, which we'll talk about more throughout this webinar. And we can go to the next slide. One other thing that for us is really important for everyone to understand in this movement to end violence against women, forced marriage is not in a silo. It is not a special problem that is unrelated to the other forms of gender-based violence that the United States has historically named in the Violence Against Women Act, for example, and worked to prevent and end. Oftentimes, someone who comes forward saying, I was forced into marriage previously and I'm not being allowed to leave, or I'm facing the threat of forced marriage, ultimately reports a history of child abuse, of being told that they, in their family, are not allowed to express preferences or go out of gendered expectations, and would be punished for doing so or resisting the marriage. It is very common for individuals who are forced into marriage to experience domestic and sexual violence. Sexual assault can be both a cause and a consequence of forced marriage, and it follows pretty logically that non-consensual sex and rape would follow a non-consensual marriage. So it's important to understand that for a survivor of forced marriage, the marriage itself is a moment of abuse, but is often sitting on a timeline of trauma that also needs to be understood and unpacked. And I love this quote from our report in 2011 from Debjani Roy, who was at that time working at Manavi, which is the oldest South Asian focused domestic violence organization in the US based in New Jersey. And they have a shelter. And they started to realize around that time that the women who were coming into shelter, who were requesting services saying, I'm experiencing abuse in my marriage, I'm experiencing sexual assault in my marriage, were not being asked at intake, what were the circumstances of your marriage in the first place? And once they started to unpack that, they realized, as many service providers did, that they were missing that piece. We were making a lot of assumptions about the nature of the onset of marital relationships when we're talking to folks who are talking about abuse within marriage and how to leave that. And that matters because the healing journey looks different than when a chosen partner who a survivor may still have loving feelings for is abusive and it's time to leave. That healing journey looks different than someone who was forced to marry in the first place, knew what the consequences would be, could not escape, and then experienced domestic and sexual violence within that marriage. So, just an important piece of this puzzle, which is that it's, again, not a harm that exists in a silo. So to shift into, this focus on banning child marriage as a critical component in the campaign to end forced marriage in the US, there are these heightened risks, as we're all sort of intuitively aware of, when you're under the age of majority. In most states, that is the age of 18. You have an incredible lack of knowledge about your rights. I mean, think about yourself at the age of 15 or 16. Did you know your constitutional rights? Did you know the state laws on age at time of marriage or domestic violence or protection orders? Who can go to a shelter, who can't? Probably not. And that is a real disadvantage, especially when we're thinking about children who are often forced into marriage with much older adults who are well aware of their rights and how to exercise them. Many times, and our clients have said this to us in the past, even when they take that chance to reach out to law enforcement hoping that they'll get help, law enforcement often defers to the rights of parents, and parental rights are enshrined in our country's constitution and more enshrined in state constitutions and state law. And our clients have reported being told that they don't believe them, that the parents said, oh, she's not well, she has mental health issues, she's off her medication. And instead of getting help, they get blamed, or in worst case scenarios, they get involuntarily admitted to psychiatric wards as delinquent youth instead of being believed and getting the help that they need. Again, when we're talking about children, they are often living with the individuals who are threatening and forcing the marriage. Unfortunately, the majority of the time, the pressure, the force, the coercion is coming from parents, and you live with them. And so when we talk about, the heightened risk when survivors choose to leave, I think a lot of people have heard about the moment of leaving is the most dangerous for a survivor of abuse. For children, it is heightened in that the failure to leave successfully, if you're turned away from a shelter or if your parents report you missing and you're removed from the friend's home whose mom said you could stay with them because they cared about you, and you're returned to your parents, the consequences can be very severe, and oftentimes people lose contact with those who were helping them, who were their shoulder to lean on, and are often removed from school or other places where they might have access to helping professionals. Again, I think a lot of times these situations also involve perpetrators who are, again, often parents, making a child feel like without them, they wouldn't be able to survive, right? Kids rely on their parents for a roof over their head, for food, for transportation, for everything. They're supposed to be the people who love and care for them most. And this idea that it will be very hard to make it on your own and be safe out there in the world as a young person is both true and also often weaponized against children who feel they just have no way out. And that also is related to this inexperience of navigating the world independently. And all of that can lead to a sense of like, I have no options and I have to do what my parents say, or else who's going to help me and where will I go? And so when we move into the next slide and the next portion of our presentation, I hope you'll just sort of keep in mind all of those reasons why, there's a million and one areas of policy and statute that need attention, that need to be fixed, improved, enhanced, et cetera, in order for US individuals to be better protected from forced marriage and from child marriage. Looking at all of those areas of advocacy as an organization like Tahare, you have to narrow, you have to focus, you have to decide what is going to have the most impact. And when we think about preventing the forced marriage of children, it's about not allowing child marriage to happen in the first place. And that's where, we started on this journey of banning child marriage at the state level. And that is also where I will hand this off to Alex, who is our resident expert on how to do that.
Thank you, Casey. Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. I'm Alex Goyette. I'm the Public Policy Manager here at Tahare, and I coordinate Tahare's state-level legislative advocacy, much of which is focused on the national campaign to ban child marriage. And just as Casey started with a definition of forced marriage, I think it's always useful to start with a definition of child. For this conversation. And when I say child in this presentation, I'm referring specifically to the legal definition of a child as someone who's under the age of majority. Generally speaking, that's age 18. There are a handful of states and territories with a higher age of majority, but you'll hear me using 18 as a shorthand. And there's not anything inherently magical about the number 18. I'll speak purely for myself here, but I know that I did not magically wake up more mature and wiser on my 18th birthday than I was the day before. But what does happen on your 18th birthday is you are afforded a new suite of legal rights that make it, while still difficult, easier to access to protection and to resist an unwanted marriage. And so that's where the power of the number 18 comes from. It just comes from our legal frameworks that establish that as the age of majority in most places. So when it comes to child marriage in the United States, I would say that Tahari does not necessarily say that every single child marriage is a forced marriage purely by definition of involving a minor. But what we do know, both from our casework and from the way that statutes are constructed and from the data gathered across the United States, is that the majority of child marriages in the U.S. involve several concerning factors that point to potential abuse or coercion in those situations. In one way that we see this is in data gathered across the United States and in every single individual state where we've looked, the vast majority of cases of child marriage involve an underage girl being married to an adult man. These are not the often imagined cases of, oh, a 16-year-old and a 17-year-old in high school who are madly in love and just want to get married before the older one graduates. That's not what shows up in the data. What we see is adult men marrying underage girls. And in many of these cases, the adults are many years or even decades older than the girl that they are marrying. And so that is a big red flag just on the data level that many of these situations are involving coercion. The way that statutes are constructed also leaves a lot of gaps that would enable coercion to flourish even within our legal system. The way that these laws are constructed, generally speaking, a state will set a marriage age of 18. Once you're an adult, once you're 18, you can go forth and marry. You don't need anyone else's permission. But then underneath that, there is a system of exceptions in place. And one of the most common exceptions that states have had in place historically, and that many states still have in place, is an exception for parental consent. And you can kind of get into the head of a lawmaker who's writing down this statute initially, thinking through, okay, well, for whatever reason, we want some minors to be able to marry, but how can we prevent kids from running off and doing something they're going to regret a few years later? Well, parents will tend to have the best interest of the child in mind, so let's make them get their parents' permission in order to marry. You can see how they get there. But when we are talking about the case of a forced child marriage, what we know, again, from our casework, from the work we've done alongside survivor advocates across the United States, is that in a case of a forced child marriage, the most common perpetrator of that coercion is the child's parents. And so what was perhaps a well-meaning law intended as a safeguard is in effect empowering the perpetrator of violence in this situation, empowering the parents to consent on behalf of their child to a marriage that that child may not want. We also see still in many states a minimum marriage age that is set lower than the state's own age of sexual consent. And so, again, we're setting up a legal framework here where the criminal law in a state would see a case where a minor is engaged in sexual acts with an adult, they would see that as a crime. But if you walk into a courthouse seeking the marriage license, which is housed within civil law, the state is awarding a marriage license in that very same case instead of treating that age difference as a red flag for an investigation or for providing services. Um, in terms of what child marriage looks like in the United States, one thing, again, that we have found in our work across the country is that it is not impacting any particular kind of person. It is not isolated to immigrant communities. It's not isolated to any particular ethnicity, to any particular religion. We've served cases where the families had every religious background you can imagine and families that had no real religious connection. And one quote that I like to share that really illustrates this is from a survivor advocate who was giving testimony to the Maryland General Assembly asking them to pursue a total ban on child marriage. She tells her own story and then she says, "That little girl was me. And my perfect soccer mom did not look like an abuser. No one saw her for what she was, and no one helped me." So it's important to keep in mind as we're talking about this issue is that it really does pervade communities and that it often shows up in ways that we might not expect. Um, I also want to point to the image here. The part of the reason for us having this webinar is we have a lot of reports online. I'll go into a little more detail about this, but all of the information I'm presenting in the webinar today is housed and publicly available on our website, tahereh.org/childmarriage. I'll point to individual reports as they come up in the presentation, but anything I say today or anything seen in the slides, you can also pull online and use for your own work. So there is a large body of research on the harms of early marriage in the United States. We have all of the information here, again, is compiled into a fact sheet available at tahereh.org/childmarriage. So I'll just quickly run through it. But marrying early impacts girls over the course of their entire life. There are lifelong impacts that can often be devastating. And the first and foremost of these are impacts to health. So girls who marry underage are at greater risk of developing a variety of serious health conditions over their entire lifespan. So even if that marriage ends when they are in their 20s, they are still at greater health risk over the course of their life because of what was faced during that marriage and the lasting impacts it's had on their lives. We also know that teen girls who marry tend to have more children earlier and more closely spaced. This points to a possible dynamic of reproductive coercion that we've often seen in our casework, and in our work alongside survivor advocates who will tell the stories of what they experienced as their own bodies being used as a tool of control against them, being forcibly made pregnant by the person they were forced to marry as a way to keep them in an unwanted marriage. And then after children are born, those children are then weaponized against them through aggressive custody battles if they do choose to use that marriage. We also know that young women and girls in the United States face intimate partner violence at much higher rates than the national average, pointing again to that vulnerability that comes with young age. There are also mental health impacts for girls who marry young. Girls marrying underage present with more psychiatric disorders, just as they present with other health issues over the course of their lifetime. And the social isolation that comes alongside being forced into a child marriage can contribute to feelings of hopelessness and poor mental health. Agencies, including Tahares, that serve underage children facing a forced marriage, know from our casework that nearly everyone in these cases has at some point contemplated suicide, and in many cases have actively attempted suicide. There are also economic impacts that, again, last over the course of the woman's entire life. So girls who married underage are more likely to live in future poverty. There's also been specific study into teen mothers and their differing outcomes depending on whether they marry underage or whether they wait and marry once they're adults. So teen mothers who marry and then divorce, which the vast majority of them do, we know that 80% of these cases end in divorce, uh, double their likelihood of future poverty throughout the course of their life. And we also know that girls who marry under age 19 are much less likely to finish high school and also much less likely to graduate from college. So I'll now get into the real core of this presentation and talk about the legal landscape, talk about the laws that enable child marriage to happen legally across the United States. And for this conversation, I want to talk first about where we started. So back before the national campaign to ban child marriage was a thing, in 2015, child marriage was legal in every single jurisdiction across the US. So that's all 50 states, every territory, and Washington, D.C. was allowing people to marry under the age of majority in some form. Um, Tahare, when we decided that we were going to address the issue of child marriage as a public policy issue, we started in our home state. We're headquartered in Virginia. And so we launched a campaign here to try to address the issue of child marriage within the Commonwealth. That led to Virginia becoming the first state to limit marriage to legal adults. So they did not entirely ban child marriage, but they held the minimum marriage age at 18, with the only exception being for minors who had gone through a special court proceeding called emancipation, where they were granted most of the legal rights of an adult, and that included the right to marriage in Virginia. The impact of that law within Virginia was about a 90% reduction in the number of children who were marrying. So prior to that law passing, there were over 100 children married within Virginia every single year, and that plummeted after this law passed. It didn't drop to zero. This was not a total ban. It was not a total win, but it was important progress. The other impact of this law was how it sparked a national wave of reforms. We have now seen laws passed to limit or ban entirely child marriage across 36 states, 3 territories, and Washington, D.C., and that all started right here in Virginia. The next year, we released a report on the statutes that enabled child marriage to happen in all 50 states and Washington, D.C. That is pictured here and again is available on our website. And we found a lot of commonalities. While every single state has its own quirks in its statute, we found a lot of common themes across every single state law. So universally, what we saw was that the state laws had a minimum marriage age of the age of majority, generally 18, but then they had exceptions, allowing children to marry underneath those age. And a lot of those exceptions followed pretty similar patterns. The most common it was the one that I have talked about already, the parental consent exception, which in effect, as we have discussed, simply enabled the most common perpetrators of forced child marriages. Um, Another common exception was for pregnancy of the minor. Uh, these statutes were essentially set up, again, in contradiction to the state's own criminal law, to take the fact of a minor who has been impregnated and see that as a reason to issue them a marriage license instead of a red flag for potential investigation or the provision of protective services. We also saw in these laws that the people issuing marriage licenses, clerks, had very little real oversight, and I would also say that they had very little power in this situation. The law did not empower them to take action when they did identify a case of abuse. The way that these laws tend to be structured is that as long as someone is checking all the statutory boxes when they walk in, the clerk must issue that marriage license. It doesn't matter if the kid is crying. It doesn't matter if the kid says they don't want to marry. If the statute doesn't say that's relevant, then the clerk has to issue the marriage license. And we, again, have worked on many cases and with many survivor advocates who tell stories just like this. They say, I walked into that courthouse crying. I was disheveled. It was clear that I didn't want to be there. And the clerk issued the marriage license. And in some cases, the clerk may not have wanted to issue that marriage license. Clerks have been some of our most important allies in this national movement seeking to ban child marriage because they are tired of issuing these marriage licenses in cases where they know there may be abuse. Most states were also not, as I said, they were not involving any sort of oversight of clerks. They were not involving judges in any way. And when those judges were involved, it was often in a very limited role. So there was not a real spelling out of what kinds of investigation should be done. There was no indication that there should be a background check or a questioning of whether the minor wanted to marry, of whether there was abuse going on or potential coercion. Really, many of these judicial oversight processes were just functioning as rubber stamps. So a law may have been structured. You can marry at 18, no questions. 16 and 17, you need a parent's permission. Under that age, you need parents and the judge's permission, but then no detail about what the judge should be looking at. So in effect, what we saw happening was that 15-year-old goes into the courthouse. The judge sees, okay, you are 15. That's old enough to marry under our law. You have your parents' permission. That box is checked. That's fine by me. Go ahead and issue the marriage license. So with all of this information in hand, seeing the scope of the problem and how these laws were constructed in a way that we knew would enable abusive and coercive marriages to go forward, Tahereh, our partners across the country, and importantly, survivor advocates, survivors of child marriage across the United States, have launched a national campaign to ban child marriage in this country. And I want to go into a little more detail about what exactly these laws looked like in 2015 before this campaign launched. So as I've discussed, before this campaign, there were no states that banned child marriage entirely. No state tied their marriage age to the age of majority. There were also no states at that time that tied marriage to legal adulthood, so for emancipated minors. Every single state had some sort of exception that allowed a pure minor with none of the legal rights of an adult to be married. Only two states at this time set an age floor of 17. A bit more common was an age floor of 16 under which no minor could marry. And then there were 9 states that set lower age floors than this. So they did still have a firm age floor where beneath which no minor could marry, but it was set at 15 or 14 or 13. And in 2015, the majority of states, 28, had no absolute age floor. So there was no age under which no one could marry as long as the statutory boxes were getting checked, a marriage license could legally be issued. And in terms of what those exceptions looked like, I talked about pregnancy exceptions. Those existed in 10 states, so about a fifth of states. Parental consent alone was enough for older minors, age 16 and 17, to marry in the vast majority of states. We've talked about why this is so dangerous. So seeing this on the books in 41 states was really troubling. And to be honest, this is still all too common. Only 8 states had judges reviewing every single application for a marriage license for a minor. And even in states that had judges involved just for younger minors, these processes, again, were really just rubber stamp processes. So we looked at all of these review processes, what safeguards were in place, and we found that the vast majority, 29 of these, were really just functioning as a rubber stamp. And then there were 5 states that set different requirements depending on gender. And for all 5 of these states, they were setting younger minimum marriage ages for girls than they were for boys. So that was a lot of bad news. I'll jump ahead to a little bit of good news now. There's been a lot of progress made since 2015. So in the last decade, we have seen 36 states, Washington, D.C., and 3 territories pass laws to at least limit, if not entirely ban child marriage. And that's what this map shows here. So to quickly highlight what we're talking about here, the dark blue states, territories, and D.C. are the jurisdictions that have entirely banned child marriage, setting a minimum marriage age of 18 with no exceptions. These are the only places that have reached our ultimate goal of no longer issuing marriage licenses to minors in any case. The sort of next tier down is the next shade lighter of blue. Those five states, Indiana, Ohio, Kentucky, Georgia, and Texas, are the five that limit marriage to legal adults. So that's what I talked about with Virginia before, where they have a marriage age of 18, with the only exception being for minors who've been emancipated through a special court proceeding. We view this as the next best thing, but certainly still not as good as banning child marriage entirely. And then we have the light blue states. These are states that have passed some sort of reform to limit child marriage, but have not limited it to legal adults and have not gone all the way to banning child marriage. What these reforms look like varies a lot. In some of these places, all they're doing is setting an age floor or raising their age floor up higher than it was in 2015. Some are instituting new judicial review processes or adding safeguards to existing ones. Some are limiting the age difference allowed between parties. And just as the structure of these reforms varies a lot, the impact of them also varies a lot. So on the positive end, we have reforms like Maryland's that again did not limit marriage to legal adults or ban child marriage entirely, but it did result in a reduction of child marriages in that state from dozens marrying every year. The year before the reform, there were 65 children married, down to just one marrying after the reform. So again, not a total ban. One child marrying is one child too many, but that's a pretty positive impact. And then you can compare that to some of these other states that passed much less protective reforms and had little to no impact at all in terms of the numbers of children marrying in those states. Then we have the maroon states here are sort of our worst case scenarios here. These states have not passed any reform, and they also set a minimum marriage age that is younger than 16. We have Kansas and Hawaii that set it at 15, and then the states with an exclamation point have the dubious honor of being the only remaining jurisdictions to set no minimum marriage age at all. Um, the exception here is California. They like to be interesting in so many ways. They have the strange position of being the only state that has passed a reform since 2016, but did not bother instituting any firm minimum marriage age. So while they did adjust their judicial review process, there is still no minimum marriage age in California. And then the remaining states here, the beige ones, are the ones that have not passed any reform since 2016, but they do at least have a firm minimum marriage age of 16 or higher. So going back to these numbers to show exactly how things have changed since 2015. As I mentioned, between the 16 states and Washington, D.C., that have banned child marriage, we're now up to 17 jurisdictions. There are also two U.S. territories on top of that that have done so, American Samoa and the Virgin Islands. Um, Inclusive of those 17 states, there are another five that only have an exception for emancipated minors, and so that puts us at 22 states that limit marriage to legal adults. And then we see an essentially increasing age floors across the board. So there are now more states setting an age floor at 16 or 17. That's up to 20 and 8 respectively. And those low age floors are decreasing. So we're down to just two states left that I mentioned that set an age floor, but set it younger than 16. And the number of states with no age floor at all has dropped dramatically, down from being previously a majority of states with no age floor at all to just the four that you saw on that map. The most dangerous exceptions are also decreasing. There are only four states left with a pregnancy exception. Parental consent alone is only enough for older minors to marry in 21 states. It's still far too many, but it's about half of what it was back in 2015. Universal judicial review is slightly more common now. There are 13 states that send all minors before a judge. And rubber stamp judicial review processes are far less common. So a lot of states have added safeguards into those processes. There are only 8 left that I would call really just a rubber stamp. And we're down to just one state left that sets different ages depending on gender. That I'll call them out because there's only one, that's Mississippi, sets a different age for boys and girls. And again, that's a younger age for girls than it is for boys. So here again we want to put a special spotlight on the 16 states in DC that have banned child marriage entirely. If your state is not listed here, child marriage is legal in your state. So how did we get here? I want to talk a little bit about how the national campaign has unfolded and what these campaigns tend to look like. One of the important parts of Tahere's model on this issue has always been a knowledge that because we need to run 50 separate campaigns across 50 separate states, plus DC, plus US territories, that's never something that Tahere was going to be able to do alone. We are a mighty team, but a a small team as well. There are only two of us working on child marriage policy specifically, and even for Casey and myself, it's only a part of our job. And so we knew from the beginning that this was never going to be something Tahrir did by itself. We needed partners, and we needed to scale up a national movement that could kind of run with its own momentum. And so while Tahrir does engage in direct advocacy, we write legislation, we build and lead coalitions, we lobby legislators directly to win them over to banning child marriage. Um, the aspect of our work that I think is much more important is the education and empowerment of other advocates and of the public more broadly. So we do a lot of work engaging media. We have webinars like the one you're attending today to inform people about this issue. And we produce and publish research that we put online and make broadly available for legislators, for advocates, for survivors, for anyone who thinks that this is an issue that needs to be addressed in their own state. And we really work hard to empower other advocates as well. We provide more targeted direct training and support for other advocates who are interested in taking on this issue. I spend a lot of time talking with domestic violence coalitions in various states, and particularly with survivor advocates who really are the heart and soul of this movement and who have led it from day one. I'll go quickly through a timeline of the reforms we've seen across the US, and I want to pull out really two patterns here. So you'll see here the reforms that have passed across the United States. I've listed them by their effective year, so just take note that this is in some cases maybe a year later than when the law was passed or when it was signed into law. But I think that's the date that's more important for someone who is facing a forced child marriage, and so I wanted that to be the date that I was using. Um, so this movement started, like I said, in Virginia, 2016. Virginia at that point was on an island, being the only state that limited marriage to legal adults. It then expanded to three more states in 2017. And then finally in 2018, we saw the first real total victory of a state banning child marriage. Delaware was the first state to do that. That's why they get underlined here. And all of the other jurisdictions that are underlined later on, those are the other places that have passed a full ban on child marriage. Also in 2018, New Jersey did the same, and American Samoa passed their own law banning child marriage. And as the movement progressed, one pattern that I really want to draw out is not just the increasing breadth, the spread across the country as we see states passing laws in new regions and more states addressing this issue, ideally through child marriage bans, but sometimes through just limits. The momentum is also shifting in the direction of states passing complete bans on child marriage. So while early in the movement, there was a lot of work to be done just convincing legislators that this was an issue happening in the U.S. That they needed to address. It's always hard to convince a state to be the first to do anything, and so Delaware being the first to take that dive, followed very quickly by New Jersey and American Samoa, was a real help, and that helped shift the momentum toward our ultimate goal of complete bans. And so by the time we're getting to 2023, 2024, and this year, we're seeing far more states pass total bans on child marriage, passing those 18 no exceptions laws, and far fewer who are only willing to go part way and limit child marriage. Um, and so I think the movement is in a really healthy place right now of many states are willing to go all the way and achieve our ultimate goal of banning child marriage. I'm going to take a closer look too at a few of the campaigns that led to child marriage bans that went into effect in 2025, just so folks can get an idea of how this tends to play out. And I think 2025 had a lot of really good examples. The first one I'll talk about is New Hampshire. So I'll start here with what the status quo pre-movement was. New Hampshire was one of those states that set not only a very young minimum marriage age at 13 for girls and 14 for boys. It was also one of the few states that differed depending on gender, again, allowing girls to marry younger than boys. The movement to address this issue in New Hampshire was actually started by a Girl Scout who took this on as her final project. Her name was Cassie. Her name, I guess, still is Cassie. And she wanted to address this issue. She knew that child marriage was wrong. She knew it was happening in New Hampshire, and she wanted her legislator to take action. So she worked with her legislator to sponsor a bill. She wanted to ban child marriage entirely. They didn't quite get that done, but in 2019, New Hampshire limited child marriage by raising that age floor up to 16, ensuring that it was the same for boys and girls, and making sure that a judge was reviewing every single case of child marriage. This law resulted in just over a 50% decline in the number of children marrying in New Hampshire year on year. So important progress, but also we're still letting half of those cases go forward. And Cassie was not satisfied with this. So she ran for office. We now call her Representative Levesque. She was elected to the New Hampshire legislature and every year since then introduced a bill to finish the job and ban child marriage entirely. Um, as a freshman legislator, you don't have a ton of power. You're still learning the ropes. You're still meeting your colleagues. It didn't pass her first year. It didn't pass her second year. It didn't pass her third year. But she kept pushing, kept reintroducing the bill, and kept building out the coalition of advocates and of legislators who knew that New Hampshire needed to finish the job here and ban child marriage. And finally, in the 2024 session, effective 2025, they succeeded and banned child marriage entirely in New Hampshire. Um, New Hampshire also has the strange position of being the only state to ban child marriage and then have a bill introduced trying to roll that ban back. In this session, there was a bill introduced to try to introduce new exceptions to the child marriage ban, led by Representative Levesque and the coalition of advocates who'd pushed for the ban in the first place. That was fortunately defeated, and so child marriage remains banned in New Hampshire. Maine is another good example here of a sort of steady progression toward a ban. In 2015, pre-movement, Maine had no minimum marriage age at all. In 2020, legislators finally put a floor in place at 16, but they were still allowing minors to marry with nothing more than a parent's permission. They raised that age up in 2023 to set it at 17, but even these sort of incremental steps were having very little impact in terms of the numbers of children marrying in Maine. In fact, in 2021, the first full year of effect for that first reform, they saw one more minor marry, and so they knew that this wasn't doing enough. They hadn't added any real safeguards. They were just tinkering around with the minimum marriage age. So finally, in 2025, they said enough is enough. We're just going to come back and ban child marriage entirely, and they did so. And then Missouri is another interesting example here. They once again in 2015, this was a state with no minimum marriage age. The original movement here was sparked in part by clerks who were tired of issuing marriage licenses to minors, even in cases where they thought there was coercion or abuse happening. That first reform in 2018 set a floor of 16 and instituted a limit on age differences between parties, so no one over age 21 was able to marry a minor in Missouri. And this had an impact similar to New Hampshire's first effort, a decline of about 55% in child marriages in Missouri. But again, advocates in the state and legislators and survivors knew that this wasn't enough. They knew Missouri had to finish the job and go all the way. And there was a renewed effort actually sparked by a survivor who was a sitting state senator. Senator Holly Reeder introduced legislation to ban child marriage. As a survivor of child marriage herself, she pushed her colleagues to end this form of harm in Missouri. And that effort finally succeeded this year in 2025, and Missouri is now one of the states that has banned child marriage entirely. Finally, I want to take a deeper look at the campaign, at a campaign that Tahari helped to lead here in Washington, D.C. We obviously have more detail here because we were one of the leading organizations. And I think this gives a really important look at all the work that goes on behind the scenes. So to set the stage here, the law in D.C. did have a firm minimum marriage age of 16 before the movement passed a reform. But above age 16, this was one of those cases where there's really no protection in place. Written consent of a single parent was enough to get a child married. There was no judge involved, just clerks, and there was also no residency requirement, which meant a minor from any state could be brought to DC for the purpose of marriage. When we pulled the data, what we saw was what we expected. 41 children had married in DC over the course of about a decade. The majority of these were marrying an adult, often much older. And we saw upticks in the number of minors married in DC in the years following reforms passed in nearby states. So we saw that lack of a residency requirement really impacting the number of children being brought to DC for marriage. If this was a campaign you were interested in and following publicly, you may have seen some of the public events that happened over the course of 2024 and 2025. As far as publicly available information went, what you would have seen was a bill introduced in September of 2024. About a month later, that had a committee hearing where advocates, including myself and my colleague Bree, and a number of survivors and advocates from other organizations spoke to council and asked them to ban child marriage. A month later, the committee voted to advance the bill. A month after that, the council voted to pass it. A month after that, the mayor signed it. Because DC is not able to fully govern themselves, laws passed by DC Council go to Congress for a period of review. And so we had about a 30-day congressional review period. nothing really happened there. Congress has the opportunity to overturn the law. They didn't do so. There was no interest in keeping child marriage legal in DC. And so finally, in towards the end of March in 2025, child marriage was banned in DC. But if you have ever run a public policy campaign, you know that a lot of that work happens behind the scenes, and it is not so quick and easy as that public timeline would suggest. This was not just a 6-month campaign. So there were a lot of organizations involved in banning child marriage in DC. The timeline I'm laying out here is just Tahereh's work. So just know that this is, even as it's a lot of work, it's also just the tip of the iceberg. There are a lot of other organizations doing work behind the scenes as well. Tahereh's initial outreach on the issue started in 2019. In 2022, we gathered data and we identified some local coalition co-leads. We were really thrilled to work alongside the DC Rape Crisis Center and the Person Center, two DC-based organizations to co-lead the DC coalition. In 2023, we launched the campaign publicly with a webinar along with survivor advocate Sarat Tasneem. We drafted legislation. We started meeting with potential sponsors. We continued expanding the coalition with other local organizations. And in 2024, the bill was finally finalized and introduced by the sponsor, Councilmember Pinto. And then we were off to the races. So the bolded things of the timeline here are those public-facing events that you might have been aware of if you followed publicly. And the non-bold stuff is everything that happened behind the scenes. So I won't go through in detail, but all of this to say is that a lot of work goes into something like this. There are a lot of meetings and a lot of follow-up with members of council. We did trainings for survivors and other advocates so they would know how the council process works, so they would be comfortable testifying. I want to shout out specifically the work of the Rape Crisis Center and the Person Center for making sure that survivors who testified at council had a comfortable place to decompress after that hearing. We had a lot of private meetings with other advocates. There were attempts to amend and weaken this bill. I had several meetings where I had to suppress those amendment attempts, which we were able to do successfully. And then we met with Delegate Holmes Norton's office after the bill had passed through DC just to ensure that they had eyes on it and could alert us if there was any opposition within Congress. So what's next? One of my favorite things about this movement right now is that every year is a surprise. There are always states where we suspect or know legislation will be introduced, and then there are always surprise states. The movement is running with some of its own momentum. It's more of a mainstream issue. So sometimes a legislator will just introduce legislation without ever having talked to me, and that is awesome. I love to see that. And so 2026, there will be some pleasant surprises like that, but we do also have some promising signs out of some states. A bill to take Texas's existing law limiting marriage to legal adults and finish the job by banning child marriage entirely made new progress last year. Their legislature doesn't meet in even numbered years, but we're going to continue working with the sponsors there to try and get that reintroduced and hopefully passed in 2027. A new, really restored coalition has just become public in Kentucky, led by survivor advocate Donna Simmons, who was an important part of getting their current law passed back in 2018, I believe it was. She is back and advocating for a total ban to child marriage there alongside the original bill sponsor. You can look up the Kentucky Rise Coalition. I'd really encourage everyone to join and support them. And then South Dakota is one of those states that hasn't passed any reform since 2016, but they had a bill, excuse me, fall short by just about 3 votes in one of their chambers last year that would have banned child marriage entirely. And so really excited to see continued efforts in South Dakota to push that bill forward next year. There are also states that have introduced bills many years in a row, and so we expect those to be back next year. Some might say that these campaigns are a bit bogged down, but I would refer to it as persistent power building. California and Hawaii are good examples of states where there has been repeated efforts introduced, never gaining the traction that they need to fully pass. But we know that the advocates on the ground and the legislators who are working on this issue are continuing to build up power every single year, and it's only a matter of time before they break through and ban child marriage as well. So beyond 2026, of course, there are still 34 states without a ban. I'm not going to be out of work to do anytime soon, nor is anyone else working in this movement. And so we have a lot of work ahead of us. There are still 3 states left that have never even introduced legislation on this issue. So there's still new ground to be broken in the movement as well. And we also know that banning child marriage is not the end. It is not the end of addressing child marriage or forced marriage broadly. I talked about 18 not being a magic number where you wake up more mature. It's also not a magic number for someone facing forced marriage. Yeah, they wake up on their 18th birthday with new legal rights and new ability to resist a forced marriage, but that doesn't mean the forced marriage goes away. Adults are forced into marriage too, and it's important to keep that in mind that the survivors we are working to support with these laws banning child marriages, they also need support as adults. Um, and so some of the issues that need to be addressed here are marriages that take place outside the law, whether through a religious institution as a religious or spiritual or cultural marriage. There may not be a marriage license issued. It may not be a legal contract, but that can still have lasting impacts and harmful impacts on the survivor's life. Access to protection orders is a whole separate presentation that I could go into, but there's a lot of work that needs to be done to improve access to protection orders for folks facing forced marriage. And we still need to strike down marital defenses to sexual assault in a lot of states. We supported a law doing that a few years ago in Maryland. California finally just struck down their last exception with our support this year. So that is another campaign that is taking place across the United States. And with that, I will hand it back to Casey to talk a bit about the state of federal law and the action needed at the federal level as well.
Thank you so much, Alex. And I hope that you now have a moment to take a deep breath and get a drink of water. Everything you just presented was incredibly encouraging for me to hear. Sometimes in the hullabaloo of everyday immigrant survivor advocacy or, the work that we're doing on the ground, you can forget just how much progress has been made on the issue of child marriage in the United States in the last 10 years. And I feel like a renewed energy around this issue just hearing you talk about it. And I want to remind folks that for the most part, the work to ban child marriage needs to happen on the state level. It is the legal purview of states to regulate age at time of marriage. And so that being said, there is a role for the federal government to play in all of this. And so I'll start by sort of what progress we have made basically in the last handful of years on moving the federal government from a place of being really sort of focused on messaging about ending child marriage globally, passing resolutions that countries everywhere else in the world need to focus on ending child marriage, but never really looking inward. And accepting that forced and child marriage is happening on U.S. soil to U.S. women and girls, and the federal government has a role to play, not only in sort of wagging our finger at other countries, but also making change domestically. So in 2022, Tahare was part of a coalition of groups that helped to draft and get the Violence Against Women reauthorization passed. And while it is, many, many, many pages long, included in that reauthorization was sort of historic language defining forced marriage as a type of harm that happens in the United States for the first time in US history. We also got some pieces into that VAWA reauthorization that required the federal government to issue a 50-state study and report on contradictions in state laws on marriage age and age of consent and statutory rape. That has been released. We are working with the Department of Justice to correct some out-of-date information that exists in that report. So, as ever, I do think it is best to rely on Tahare work product for accuracy in this data, but I think the DOJ report is still extremely valuable. For the most part, it is accurate, and it really helps to have the backing of the federal government when it comes to researching and reporting on these issues and these harms. And there is some sub-regulatory guidance. So what that means is that it's not statute, it's not law, but it's like the instructions that adjudicators at USCIS, so U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services, has to follow when a marriage-based petition, so someone who's married a person who lives overseas, born and raised overseas, and wants to bring that person to the United States, or someone who is engaged to someone overseas and wants to bring that person to the United States. So USCIS does now have sub-regulatory guidance instructing them to look at ages and age differences when a minor is involved, and to look at the law of the state where the couple intends to reside and assess whether or not that marriage or engagement would have been legal in the state where they intend to reside. That doesn't instruct USCIS to automatically deny those petitions, but it does instruct them to look very carefully at the legality of that marriage and the dynamics between the two parties if a minor is involved. The gaps that still remain are that there are no minimum ages set by statute for a petitioner of a marriage-based visa or a foreign beneficiary of a marriage-based visa. There are no prohibitions on child marriage on federal land or federal facilities. There is still a consummation exception to proxy marriage being marriages that can take place without one or both parties actually even present, which incentivizes sexual assault and rape after a marriage in order to sort of validate a proxy marriage. There's no model statute and there's no incentives coming from the federal government in terms of encouraging states and providing the financial support for states to study this issue and make change. And I will say these gaps in federal law, especially those gaps in minimum marriage ages in the marriage-based visa program, have led to some pretty disturbing dynamics, including over 8,500 marriage-based visas being approved by USCIS, even though they involve at least one minor. When you dig into that data even deeper, you will find that the majority of the time it is an adult US citizen male petitioning for a foreign-born child. And we talk a lot at Tahare about the vulnerabilities of brides and fiancés who immigrate to the United States and find themselves in abusive situations. They don't speak the language, they don't have family and friends. They are often also not certain of their rights and resources. And when you think about all of those things compounded on an individual who's under the age of 18 and plucked from their family home and brought to the United States to live as a bride or a spouse to a much older man, there are huge red flags that should be going off, and we definitely need to fill these gaps in law. And so if we go to the next slide, you'll see that we are working on that. And so I am excited to share that last year we did see the introduction of historic legislation from Senator Durbin, Senator Schatz, and Senator Gillibrand, the first federal bill of its kind to look to fill these gaps in law to better protect U.S. women and girls and foreign-born women and girls from a threat of child marriage and being able to be brought to the United States as a child bride under the guise of marriage, and a lot to incentivize and push for change domestically, as with what is in their purview, including bumps to formula grants for states that have ended child marriage, funding for state task forces for those who haven't, so that advocates working on the ground who are stretched thin already have some support to get this work done. And of course, setting minimum ages of marriage for the petitioner and the beneficiary at 18. And more things that the federal government can do. This is a pretty sizable piece of legislation, national commission, a ban on child marriage on federal land, another impact study that would look at actual prevalence, especially in those states that still refuse to provide data, and again, that model state statute. So states that are interested in banning child marriage can look to see what the DOJ says is best practice and move swiftly to do so. So we are working with the bill sponsors now on reintroduction. We hope to see that soon. And of course, we will share that out with everyone once it happens. And I know we are right on time, Alex, our roadshow. We run a very tight ship, but I am happy to stay on to answer any questions people might have. But I'll also look to Rachel if you just want to wrap us up and have folks get in touch with us if they have any questions after absorbing everything from today's conversation.
Thank you so much, Casey and Alex. What a great panel. Please feel free, if you do have questions, to drop them in the chat. Otherwise, our contact information for Alex is on the screen right now. We are grateful for your time, attention, and commitment to this really incredibly important work, especially during this very busy time of both the year and also just in life. If anything during today's conversation resonated with you, we hope you will sign up for our newsletter And you could also make an impact by visiting our website and making a donation. Thank you for being with us today, and we hope to see you again at a future event. Take care.
Thank you. Bye, everybody.